If you were a sticky little American child like I was back in the day, then there's a solid chance you spent a portion of every weekday on a school bus. These big yellow vehicles are an icon of the American suburbs, and a testament to just how little we trust our children with an ounce of independence. Yet they're absolutely essential to our education system, and serve a very important link between residential areas and schools across the nation. Without these buses and the dedicated drivers behind their wheels, every day hundreds of thousands of children would be much happier. But that's not to say that school buses have a negative connotation. Some of my best memories from school were made possible by the various bus drivers I had over the years. Quick shout out to the one guy who was in a band and got fired for playing heavy metal music on the radio and had to apologize to my entire neighborhood. But that's all besides the point. The purpose of this video is to look into how school buses came about and how they've changed over the years, both in terms of style and safety features. Throughout much of the 19th century, prior to the invention of motorized vehicles, simple horse-drawn carriages were used to transport children who were further than walking distance from school. At the time, access to education was poor nationwide, and oftentimes the determining factor for one's future potential was their ability to get to and from the schoolhouse. Once education was made mandatory beginning in 1852 in Massachusetts, the US saw an increased need for some kind of formal transportation option for children. The first official school carriage, known as a kid hack or a school hack, was invented by the Wayne Works Company in 1886. Contrary to the popular belief that these children were made of computer code, the term hack is actually short for hackney, another word used to refer to this type of carriage. These industrially produced wagons were still horse-drawn, but with a number of features which differentiated them from their more rudimentary predecessors, such as perimeter bench seating and an entrance and exit door located at the rear of the wagon. The latter of these features, though now used for a different purpose, is still present on modern-day school buses. In 1914, during the boom of the automotive industry, the Wayne Works Company saw a market for motorized school transport and as such invented the first school bus. Though outside of motorization, these buses saw only small improvements over horse-drawn wagons in terms of comfort or safety features. The only shelter in these buses outside of wooden paneling was often a tarp to cover the windows, and a simple roof which did little to protect children from the environment. There were various competitors which released their own versions of school buses throughout the rest of the 1910s and 20s, as school transportation became publicly funded in all US states in 1919, though the majority of these competitors did not survive to see the end of the Roaring Twenties. The next large development in the industry saw the invention of a school bus called Bluebird No. 1 by a man named A.L. Luce in 1927, which was effectively a Ford Model T retrofitted with a steel panel reinforced passenger compartment. Prior to this point, the primary material used to build school buses had been wood, but as engines improved and driving speeds inched higher, wooden vehicles struggled to hold up structurally. Luce's invention was an instant success, leading him to found his own company, Bluebird, which is still one of the leading manufacturers of school buses in the country today. 3 years later, in 1930, the Wayne Works Company released their competitor to the Bluebird No. 1, which was composed entirely of steel and featured glass windows, also moving the entrance and exit door to the side of the vehicle to prevent children from having to walk in the road, repurposing the back door as an emergency exit. As school buses continued to grow in popularity, schools across the nation were able to consolidate, which both increased education quality and the need for student transport, as many rural children found themselves living quite far from their schools. At this point in time, school buses were largely unregulated, and though there were a handful of larger companies such as Dodge, Crown Motor Carriages, Gillig, and the aforementioned Wayne Works and Bluebird, there were also thousands of independently manufactured school buses, mostly pre-existing trucks modified with a large passenger compartment. This disconnected net of buses varied in quality significantly, which pushed forward efforts to regulate the industry and standardize safety features. In 1939, spearheaded by education expert Dr. Frank W. Sear, transportation authorities from across the U.S. were brought together to formulate a set of 44 standards to allow for the mass production of safer school buses. Many of these standards no longer exist, except for a few things such as forward-facing seats and the adoption of the iconic yellow color which still remain in effect today. This specific shade of yellow is officially known as National School Bus Glossy Yellow, chosen as it was found to be the easiest color to see regardless of weather conditions or light levels, as well as the color which the human brain could register quickest. During World War II, many US bus manufacturers temporarily shifted to producing vehicles for the military. Following the war and coinciding with both the rise of the American suburb and the massive influx of the baby boomer generation, the 1950s were a breakout era for the school bus, which was no longer only a rural necessity. To accommodate for the increase in student population, manufacturers began to make larger buses built on heavy-duty truck chassis, with the industry introducing diesel engines on some models throughout the latter half of the decade. In addition, smaller advancements such as the invention of wheelchair lifts and padded bus seats improved accessibility and safety for riders. This decade also saw the first predecessors of the small or short bus, usually modified SUVs such as the Chevrolet Suburban, which were used both in dense urban settings where a bus would be be impractical, and rural settings where there was no need for a large capacity vehicle. The 1960s saw a rise in concern over motor vehicle safety, especially when it came to keeping our nation's children safe. At the time, school buses were made up of a number of small metal panels which would bend and sometimes break at connecting points in the event of a collision. Once this weak point was identified, bus manufacturers began to use larger panels to reduce weak points, and were able to successfully begin producing buses which were able to retain structural integrity in the event of a rollover incident. The 1970s was another incredibly transformative decade for school buses, especially when it came to safety features. In 1973, school buses became federally regulated, and the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration began work on the first 5 federal motor vehicle safety standards for school buses. That same year, the first of these standards went into effect, having to do with emergency exits, both standardizing their location and function, but also introducing engine interlock devices which prevent the engine from starting when an emergency exit is open. 4 years later, in 1977, more regulations went into place which further regulated rollover safety, body panel joint integrity, engine integrity to prevent fuel spillages, as well as instituting taller, more padded passenger seats for collision protection. In addition, though not mandatory at the time, swing-out stop arms with flashing lights became a widespread feature on the newest buses. It's important to note that the size of school buses made them subject to many heavy vehicle regulations at the time, which mostly improved lighting and other visibility features. The previously mentioned smaller buses shifted to being more bus-like as opposed to car-like for the sake of safety, using cutaway van chassis to produce the small buses we know today. Heading into the 80s, bus manufacturers began to struggle for the first time in decades. As the last of the baby boomers graduated high school, student populations nationwide decreased, and coupled with the recession economy of the early 80s, the bus manufacturing industry was forced to slow production. A few of the main 8 companies at the time filed for bankruptcy and re-emerged to produce more niche student transport vehicles such as small buses. In 1986, standards were raised for school bus drivers, as obtaining a commercial driver's license was made mandatory for the first time, in order to assure consistent training across the nation. This set in motion a theme for the next decade or so, as many regulations focused heavily on the driver. Bus design favored a higher up and more forward driver seating position, with some features such as cross-view mirrors and automatic transmissions moving from niche additions to standard on new production buses. Interior ergonomics around the driver were also greatly improved to prevent distracted driving, simplifying the numerous buttons and switches which control various elements of the bus. Other improvements during the 80s saw more widespread usage of diesel engines for both large and small school buses, as well as an increase in emergency exits, with the addition of roof exits, side-mounted doors, and swing-out as opposed to pop-out windows. An interest in increased visibility and turning radius resulted in the production of cab-over, also known as transit-style school buses, where the driver would sit in front of the steer axle and the engine was moved to either the rear of the bus or underneath the driver. This style of bus could hold the same number of students as conventional buses, though in a smaller body, leading manufacturers to produce many of these models throughout the rest of the 20th century, though over time they grew in size to accommodate more students than their conventional counterparts. The 1990s was a slower decade in terms of bus advancements, with 4 of the leading manufacturers closing their doors by the turn of the century. One of the largest changes to school buses in this decade was the addition of the school bus crossing arm, which prevents students from walking directly in front of the bus where the driver cannot see them. During this decade, the US finally banned the use of large passenger vans for student transport, leading to the rise of multi-function school activity buses, which differed from previous small bus models as the interior mimicked a school bus in terms of safety features, seating type, and appearance. The exterior, however, was usually white or another non-yellow bright color, and without features such as stop arms, signage, and lighting, as these buses were not for exclusively school use. These were and still are a popular option for many religious schools which use activity buses for both school and church transport, as well as after-school and daycare programs. The 2000s marked the beginning of a new wave of manufacturer consolidation, which allowed for more widespread implementation of new safety features, mostly coming from within the companies themselves as opposed to regulators, as safety became the #1 selling point for school buses. In terms of style, conventional bus hoods were sloped more for visibility, but most of the advancements were, again, in safety. Incandescent lights were replaced with LEDs as they are easier to see in bright conditions. Interior-facing cameras and advanced alarm systems known as No Student Left Behind systems were installed to detect and prevent children from being left unattended on buses, as forgotten children would sometimes end up in the bus depot. These systems require that a bus driver travels to the back of the bus to activate either a switch or the rear emergency door every time the engine is shut off, giving them an opportunity to check all the seats for students. Throughout the 2010s, most advancements were in electronics, as buses became fitted with exterior cameras, GPS tracking devices, and proximity sensors. Today, buses are the safest form of road travel in the US, being over 70 times safer than riding to school by car. Yet, the vast majority still do not have any seatbelts, mostly because the size of a bus is so large that in the event of a crash, there is much less force felt by the passengers. This is not to say that seatbelts aren't used at all, with 5 states requiring some form of belt, mostly used during highway travel. Buses also have priority under the law, with other drivers having to stop for them when picking up or dropping off passengers. If you've ever ridden a school bus over railroad tracks, you might notice the driver stopping, opening the door, and listening, a standard practice that was implemented to prevent train collisions. In the US and Canada, school buses are required to be purpose-built and distinct from all other vehicles, with regulations enforcing a 2-axle, single-deck design, and the classic school bus text above the front windshield and back door. Currently, there are 4 different kinds of school buses produced in North America. Type A and B are short buses, the difference between them being that Type A are derived from cutaway chassis, while Type B are built on bare chassis. An easy way to tell which is the presence of a driver's side door, which is only a feature on Type A's. Type C is the most commonly seen on roads with a front engine hooded design, whereas Type D is either front or rear engine with a transit body style. Current school bus safety features differ based on state law, though some common ones I have yet to mention are reflective tape, kick-out windshields, locking in place emergency exit doors, heated mirrors, exhaust brake systems, lighting system status boards, and seatbelt cutters. As is the trend in the automotive industry right now, there is a push to electrify school buses, though these are still a rarity due to their price. Most school districts simply can't afford them yet. Right now, there are about 360,000 school bus drivers in the US, and as time passes on, there will only be an increased need for drivers. For the foreseeable future, school bus drivers are surprisingly safe from the threat of automation, as it would be a tough sell for parents to trust a computer with their child's safety. The job is much more than simply driving a bus, as drivers are responsible for ensuring the proper functioning of the vehicle, child safety, and, at least in my experience, making the trips to and from school a little less painful. Seriously, I rode the bus for around 8 years as a kid, and the various bus drivers I had over the course of those years were some of the coolest adults I interacted with at that age. And though they told me to study hard so I didn't end up like them, I always thought it would be fun to drive a school bus. Thanks for watching, and let me know what kind of video you'd like to see next. Also, before I go, and I apologize for this in advance, I promised a certain individual that I would include the following.
Hey Tone, I just found out about school buses. They're telling me they use them to transport students. If it were up to me, I'd use them to transport a big fat bowl of spaghetti. Come on now, Tone. Don't need to cry like that, Tone. You're making me uncomfortable.
Alright, that's enough of that. Bye.